welcome to the deep dive. We got your request, and yeah, this one's a classic. You asked us to dig into Project Stargate, and specifically, all the controversy.
And there's a lot of it. We're talking psychic spies, Cold War paranoia, secret government files,
Yeah.
the works.
It's a story that honestly sounds like science fiction half the time, but it was real. A $20 million, decades-long U.S. government program.
That's right. But before we even start, we absolutely have to clear something up. The name, Project Stargate.
Right, because if you Google Project Stargate today, you get something completely different.
Exactly. There are two massive, very high-stakes U.S. initiatives with the same code name. It's confusing.
So let's define our terms. Entity number one, that's our focus today.
This is the original historical Project Stargate, ran from roughly 1972 to 1995, managed by the CIA, the DIA, the Army. It moved around.
And this was the one looking into, what, anomalous cognition? Is that the official term?
Yeah, anomalous cognition, psychoenergetics, but mostly remote viewing. The idea that people could, psychically see things far away.
Right. The goal being a strategic advantage, right? A leap over the Soviets using the mind.
Precisely. A $20 million bet on consciousness as a weapon, or at least an intelligence tool, a gateway through the mind.
Okay. Then there's entity number two, the modern Project Stargate.
This one's huge, running from 2025 onwards, and it's not about psychics at all. It's about silicon.
AI, massive AI infrastructure.
Gargantuan. You've got SoftBank, OpenAI, Microsoft, NVIDIA, all collaborating, and the proposed cost, up to $500 billion.
$500 billion. That puts the original $20 million in perspective.
It really does. The first Stargate, consciousness. The second, computational power, brute force AI.
But the underlying goal,
Oh.
it feels weirdly similar, both chasing some kind of ultimate strategic edge.
It's the same ambition, isn't it? Seeking that gateway, whether it's beyond known physics or through artificial general intelligence. But yeah, for this deep dive, we're sticking firmly to the original, the Cold War Stargate, the psychic spies, the declassified files, the hits, the misses, and importantly, the evidence against the legend.
Okay, mission set. Let's dive into the origin story. Section 1, the Cold War catalyst. This wasn't some bright idea the U.S. had on its own, was it? It was reactive.
Completely reactive. It all kicked off around 1972. Classified reports started landing on desks at the CIA.
Reports about the Soviets.
Yeah. Alleging massive Soviet investment in something they called psychotronic research. ESP, psychokinesis, moving stuff with your mind, the whole paranormal package, supposedly weaponized for spying.
Psychotronic.
Yeah.
Even the word sounds ominous. Did the U.S. agencies take it seriously?
Oh, absolutely. The reports claim the Soviets were pouring tens of millions of rubles into this annually. That kind of figure, true or not, sparks immediate Cold War paranoia.
The fear being?
What?
That the Soviets had cracked psychic spying.
Exactly. That they'd found a way to gather intelligence that bypassed all our satellites, all our listening posts, a vulnerability we couldn't even detect. It was the psychic gap.
Like the bomber gap, the missile gap, but weirder.
Much weirder. But the fear was just as real. If the Soviets were spending that much, the thinking went, they must be getting results. So the U.S. felt compelled to figure out what they were doing and maybe even try to do it themselves.
But here's the irony you mentioned earlier. Despite this high-level fear, the program itself was toxic institutionally.
Totally. The giggle factor, that's what they called it internally.
Draining.
Meaning admitting you were funding spoon benders and remote viewers. That was career suicide for any serious intelligence officer or politician. The ridicule, the potential media exposure, it was radioactive.
So how does a program that nobody wants to own, that everyone's kind of embarrassed by, survive for 23 years?
Through what our sources call a bureaucratic shell game, constant shuffling, constant rebranding.
Hiding in plain sight.
Pretty much. Keep changing the name, keep moving it between agencies, and you avoid consistent oversight. You reset the budget clock. You dodge the really tough questions when failures pile up or the whispers get too loud.
Let's trace that shell game.
Yeah.
Starts with the CIA, 1972. Codename ScanIt.
Right. ScanAte, scan by coordinate. They funded physicists Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI. The initial idea was practical. Find downed Soviet bombers, locate hidden missile silos using psychic coordinates.
How did that go?
Spectacularly badly. The early operational attempts were total failures. No verifiable hits.
So the CIA got cold feet pretty quickly.
Very quickly. Two main reasons, it seems. One, the lack of results. Intelligence programs need wins fast. Two, the internal mockery factor. The CIA prides itself on, professionalism, involving celebrity psychics like Uri Geller that didn't sit well with the old guard.
The cost of the ridicule outweighed the potential benefit.
Basically, yeah. So they looked for someone else to take it off their hands.
The hot potato gets passed. Who caught it?
By the late 70s, it mainly landed with the U.S. Army and the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, operating mostly out of Fort Meade in Maryland.
And the name changes started rolling in.
Oh, yeah. Between 77 and 91, you had Grill Flame, Gondola Wish, Center Lane, Sunstreak. It just kept shifting.
It really sounds like a series of small, almost disconnected projects, rather than one continuous effort.
That's a really good way to put it. Same core idea, often the same people, but constantly repackaged to stay alive. It wasn't until 1991, near the very end, that they finally consolidated everything under the name we know now, Project Stargate.
And that constant name changing is itself a kind of evidence, isn't it? Successful, high-priority programs usually stick with one name.
Absolutely. It signals instability, a lack of confidence, a need to hide. And throughout this, they kept the actual research mostly at arm's length, right? Using contractors.
Mostly, yes. SRI with Puthoff and Targ handled the foundational stuff from 72 up to about 88. Then, when the Army DA focus shifted more towards operations, the research side moved over to Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC.
A big defense contractor, right. And that's where Edwin May took over as the lead researcher and eventually program director until the end in 95. Keeping it with contractors gave the government plausible deniability. Oh, we were just funding some research to assess a potential threat.
To assess the Soviet threat, of course. Okay, let's pivot to Section 2. Because this is where the real controversy starts, maybe even before the first experiment.
Yeah.
The people involved.
Yes. The core controversy. Because you look at the key personnel, both the researchers and the viewers, and you find compromised objectivity right from the start.
Let's name names. The viewers. The supposed psychics first.
The star operator was probably Joseph McMonigal, Army Chief Warrant Officer. They called him Viewer Number 1. He did hundreds of sessions, apparently. And get this, he was even awarded the Legion of Merit for his psychic spying work.
A Legion of Merit for remote viewing. Wow, okay.
Who else?
Ingo Swann. An artist, actually, but he's credited with really systemizing the whole thing. He coined the term remote viewing and developed the coordinate remote viewing, or CRV, protocols, strict steps to trying to make it repeatable.
Trying to make it scientific.
Or appear scientific, maybe. And then there was Pat Price, a former police commissioner. Considered a psychic treasure by the researchers, supposedly very gifted, very accurate. And the researchers giving it that scientific sheen. We mentioned Puthoff and Targ.
Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, both physicists. Their credentials were key to getting that initial CIA funding, but the person who really got the government interested, the catalyst, wasn't one of these guys. It was a celebrity.
Don't tell me. Uri Geller.
Uri Geller, the spoonbender himself. He was tested by Puthoff and Targ at SRI in 1973. And their official report concluded he demonstrated paranormal ability in an unambiguous manner. That conclusion, however flawed, was pure gold for the program's proponents. It was the political ammo they needed to keep the money flowing.
Okay, but you mentioned a deeper issue. A conflict of interest baked in from the start.
Yes. This is crucial and often glossed over, the Scientology connection.
Scientology, how does that fit in?
Declassified documents and investigative reports confirm that key players, specifically researcher Hal Puthoff and the two most lauded psychics, Ingo Swann and Pat Price, were all deeply involved with the Church of Scientology in the early 1970s, right when the program was starting.
Involved how deeply?
Not just casual members. Records show Puthoff and Swann achieved OT Level 7, operating Thetan Level 7.
Which means?
In Scientology doctrine, reaching that level signifies you're considered capable of operating as a spiritual being, a thetan, separate from your physical body. You've achieved a high degree of spiritual awareness and ability.
And how does that relate to remote viewing? Is there a doctrinal link?
There's a concept in Scientology called exteriorization. It's the idea that the thetan, the spiritual self, can consciously leave the body and perceive things remotely, move outside the physical form.
Okay, I see where this is going. That sounds almost exactly like the definition of remote viewing.
It's incredibly similar, perceiving things distant in time or space, not using the physical senses. So the people designing and running the foundational experiments and some of the key subjects weren't skeptics testing a hypothesis.
They were believers.
They were already immersed in a belief system where the core concept of remote viewing exteriorization was accepted as fact, as a spiritual achievement.
So the experiments weren't really about if it worked, but how to make it work reliably for spying.
Exactly. It wasn't a skeptical inquiry. It was an attempt to validate and operationalize a pre-existing metaphysical belief. This creates a huge vulnerability to confirmation bias. You want to believe it works, so you're more likely to interpret ambiguous results as successes.
And that makes them prime targets for, well, performers like Geller.
Or just prone to misinterpreting noise as signal. If you already believe in exteriorization, a vague drawing that kind of looks like the target seems like proof, not a lucky guess or sensory leakage. Critics argue this inherent bias fatally flawed the research from day one.
It's reported this Scientology link actually caused some agencies to pull funding later on, once they found out.
That's been reported, yes. It highlights the internal conflict. The program survived the external giggle factor through bureaucracy, but it survived internal skepticism, partly because the core group was already convinced.
A paradox indeed. Okay, but let's look at why anyone kept funding it, despite the weirdness and the bias. Section 3. The greatest hits. The stories they told themselves, the evidence proponents still point to.
These are the crown jewels of the Stargate legend, the claims that kept it alive. We have to start with Uri Geller at SRI in '73, because that's what kicked the funding door open.
Right, isolated in the shielded room. Someone draws a picture based on a random word. Geller tries to replicate it.
And the results seemed amazing at the time. Target word, fuse. The researcher draws a firecracker. Geller draws a cylinder, smoke coming out, labels it noise.
Okay, that's pretty close.
Target, a bunch of grapes. Geller draws a very similar cluster of circles. Based on maybe 8 or 9 trials like this, SRI wrote that report calling his ability unambiguous. That's case file 1.
Case file 2. Ingo Swarm looks at Jupiter before the probes got good pictures.
April 1973. Swan does a remote viewing session focused on Jupiter. He describes bands of crystals near the planet and crucially says maybe like rings of Saturn, though not far out like that.
And the claim is
6 years later, in 1979, NASA's Voyager 1 officially discovers Jupiter does have rings. Proponents seize on this. Swan saw them psychically, years in advance. Pure precognition.
Okay, moving from space to spies. Case file 3. Pat Price and the Soviet secret site. Semipalatinsk, 1974.
This one sounds incredibly impressive the way proponents tell it. Price is supposedly given only the geographic coordinates, nothing else. A true blind test.
And he's supposedly described
A unique, giant gantry crane moving on rails or big wheels. And even weirder, a massive metal sphere, maybe 60 feet across, being assembled out of curved sections like orange peels or gores.
things you wouldn't just guess are at a secret Soviet base.
Exactly. And the clincher, proponents say, is that later satellite photos, maybe published in Aviation Week, confirmed the crane and the sphere. Proof positive Price saw inside a top-secret facility.
Okay, that's compelling if true. Finally, case file 4. Joseph McMonigle, Bureau Number 1, and the Typhoon Submarine, 1979.
This is often presented as the ultimate operational success. The National Security Council, the NSC, tasks the remote viewing unit. Figure out what the heck the Soviets are building inside this enormous, mysterious building at the Severodvinsk shipyard.
A black box target.
Right. McMonigle does the viewing. He sketches and describes a huge, previously unknown submarine. He specifically notes a double hull design and strangely angled missile tubes, and he predicts it will be launched in about 4 months.
And the punchline.
January 1980, U.S. spy satellites confirmed the launch of the first Typhoon-class submarine. Massive, double-hulled, just as described, right on schedule. Proponents add other alleged hits too, finding hostages in Iran, locating kidnapped U.S. General Dozier in Italy.
Wow. Okay, if you just heard that list, Geller's drawings, Jupiter's rings, the crane, the Typhoon, you'd think Stargate was one of the most effective intelligence programs ever.
You absolutely would. It sounds like undeniable proof.
But you asked us for all the controversy. So now we hit Section 4, the systematic skeptical rebuttal, using the same declassified documents to take these hits apart, piece by piece.
This is where the legend collides with scrutiny. When magicians, psychologists, and other critics like James Randi finally got access to the full files, not just the cherry-picked successes, the picture changed dramatically.
They found methodological flaws, poor controls.
Worse, they found evidence suggesting outright fraud in some cases, significant front-loading of information in others, and just basic confirmation bias running rampant. Let's start with Geller again.
The foundation. The guy whose unambiguous success got the ball rolling.
Right. How unambiguous was it, really? First, there's the testimony from people around him. His own manager, Yasha Katz, reportedly admitted helping Geller cheat in stage performances using signals.
Signals, like hand gestures.
Exactly. Pointing a cigarette up for blue, things like that. A declassified 1977 CIA memo actually discusses these reports. They knew, or at least strongly suspected, they might be dealing with a stage magician using tricks.
But they kept funding based on SRI's report. How does that work?
Because SRI wanted him to be real, Puthoff and Targ were invested. And once you have that initial validation from credible scientists, even if flawed, it creates bureaucratic momentum. The possibility he was real, confirming the Soviet psychic threat, was politically useful, even if they had doubts. Failures could be explained away.
And his documented failures under controlled conditions are pretty stark.
The classic is The Tonight Show in 1973. Johnny Carson, himself a former magician, was tipped off by James Randi about Geller's likely methods.
So Carson made sure Geller couldn't cheat.
Precisely. Randi told him, use props Geller hasn't touched beforehand. No access before the show. Sealed containers. Geller came out, sat there for 22 agonizing minutes on live TV, and couldn't do a thing. No bending, no drawing replication, nothing.
What was his excuse?
He famously blamed the pressure, the skepticism, the negative vibes, the standard performers out when the trick fails under scrutiny.
And back at SRI, that shielded room wasn't exactly foolproof either.
Critics jumped all over that. There was apparently a hole drilled in the wall for cables or ventilation. Small, maybe, but potentially enough for auditory cues, whispers, something. Plus, the protocols were often lax. People went in and out. It wasn't the pristine laboratory condition proponents implied. Geller's case looks less like psychic proof and more like motivated researchers being fooled by a performer.
Okay, debunking Geller chips away at the foundation. What about Swan and Jupiter's rings? The precognition claim.
That one crumbles under scrutiny, too. First, the idea that Jupiter might have rings wasn't completely out of left field in 1973.
Really? I thought Voyager discovered them unexpectedly.
Voyager confirmed them visually. But data from the Pioneer 10 and 11 probes, which flew by Jupiter around 73-74, had already shown some weird interference patterns with charged particles near the planet. Some astronomers were already speculating publicly that faint rings could be the cause.
So Swan might have just been aware of these scientific hypotheses. An educated guess.
That's the argument. It wasn't pulled from thin air. More importantly, though, you have to look at the actual transcript of Swan's viewing. He wasn't actually accurate.
How so? He said rings.
So maybe like rings, but then he described them as being very close within the atmosphere, like right near the cloud tops.
And Jupiter's actual rings are?
They're well outside the atmosphere. They're far out, to use Swan's own contrasting phrase about Saturn's rings. So he got the key physical characteristic wrong.
So the hit is only a hit if you ignore the incorrect details and focus on the one-word wings, which was already being speculated about.
Precisely. It's classic post hoc validation. Cherry-picking the bits that fit and ignoring the bits that don't.
Okay, now the big one. Pat Price and the semi-palitance crane and sphere. The blind test where he only got coordinates. What do the real files say?
This is probably the most blatant misrepresentation in the Stargate lore. The declassified operational analysis completely contradicts the blind test narrative. It's just false.
So he wasn't just given coordinates?
No way. The documents are explicit. Price was heavily front-loaded before the viewing session.
Front-loaded, meaning?
Meaning they briefed him, they showed him maps of the area, they told him the target was near Semipalatinsk. They specifically told him it was a scientific military research and test area.
So, he knew exactly where he was supposed to be looking and what kind of facility it was?
Yes.
Yeah.
He wasn't psychically discovering secrets. He was likely using his intelligence and imagination to flesh out details about a location and context he'd just been briefed on. The crane, the sphere, maybe astute deductions based on the briefing, maybe lucky guesses, maybe even information subtly hinted at by the briefers. But it absolutely wasn't pure psychic perception of the unknown.
The smoking gun here is that the claim of it being a blind test is just directly refuted by the program's own internal documents.
That's the key takeaway. The legend relies on omitting that crucial fact.
All right, final hit. McMoneagle and the Typhoon submarine. Supposedly totally unknown before his viewing.
Also demonstrably false, according to the declassified record. The idea that U.S. intelligence was clueless about the Typhoon in September 1979 just doesn't hold water.
What's the evidence against that?
There's declassified testimony from the Director of Central Intelligence, the DCI, given to the Senate Armed Services Committee. The date, January 23rd, 1979.
9 months before McMoneagle's viewing session.
Exactly. And in that public testimony, the DCI explicitly states that the Soviet submarine program is believed to be transitioning from the older Delta class to the new Typhoon class.
So the existence of the Typhoon class was known at the highest levels of intelligence, well before McMonigle's viewing.
It was a known unknown. They knew it was coming. They knew it was big. They were actively looking for it. It was a top intelligence priority.
So why task a remote viewer?
Likely because they had ambiguous satellite photos of that huge construction hall at Severodvinsk. They knew something massive was inside, probably the Typhoon, but they wanted confirmation or details the photos couldn't provide. What did it look like?
And McMonigle himself wasn't just some random guy, right? He had relevant experience.
He was a chief warrant officer with a background in signals intelligence. He was trained to analyze incomplete data and make informed deductions about military targets. He was reportedly even shown the satellite photos before the session.
So his hit, describing the double hull, the launch date, was likely skilled intelligence analysis, interpreting ambiguous imagery within the known context that the Typhoon was the hot topic, not a psychic revelation.
That's the skeptical interpretation, and it fits the available evidence much better than psychic discovery. He was good at his job, which involved analysis, not just psychic perception.
Okay, so when you line up the greatest hits against the actual declassified records and critical analysis, they all seem to dissolve. Methodological flaws, confirmation bias, front-loading skilled analysis, misinterpreted as psychic.
Pretty much. The sensational stories fall apart under forensic scrutiny. The controversy isn't really about whether these hits happened exactly as described in the legend. The controversy is that the legend ignores the documented context that explains them conventionally.
Which leads us logically to Section 5, the official verdict. The program limps along until 1995. Cold War's over. Congress has had enough.
Yep. The funding is drying up, the justification, the Soviet psychic threat is gone. Congress mandates that the whole thing gets transferred back to the CIA for one final independent evaluation.
And the CIA hires outside experts.
They commission the American Institutes for Research, AR, to conduct a thorough review of the entire program history, both the lab research and the operational attempts.
And AR brings in two key academics to assess the data, representing both sides of the debate.
That's right. This is the famous Utz versus Hyman showdown. You had Dr. Jessica Utz, a statistician from UC Davis, who was generally sympathetic to the possibility of psi phenomena.
And on the other side,
Dr. Ray Hyman, a cognitive psychologist from the University of Oregon, and a very well-known, very rigorous skeptic associated with CSICOP, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry.
so they both looked at the same body of laboratory research data from SRI and SEAKey.
Exactly the same data. And they came to starkly different conclusions, which really highlights the core scientific controversy.
What did Dr. Utz conclude?
Utz focused purely on the statistics. Looking at the results of controlled laboratory remote viewing trials over decades, she found the results were statistically significant to an astronomical degree. Far, far beyond what you'd expect by chance.
Like the odds were billions to one against chance.
In some experiments, yes. The effect size wasn't necessarily huge, but it was persistent and statistically undeniable. Her conclusion was blunt. Using the standards applied in any other field of science, the existence of psychic functioning was, in her view, scientifically proven.
Proven. That's a strong word in science.
Extremely strong. She argued the stats were so overwhelming that denying the phenomenon was irrational, based purely on the numbers. She recommended continued research.
Okay, so how did Dr. Hyman look at the same numbers and disagree?
Hyman didn't dispute Utz's math. He agreed the statistical results were anomalous, calling them inexplicable statistical departures from chance. He even conceded the case for psi seems stronger than ever.
Right.
But he argued that statistical significance alone is not proof. Science requires more. It requires independent replication, robust methodology, and plausible mechanisms. Hyman felt Stargate's data failed on those counts.
What were his main criticisms?
He argued the results hadn't been reliably replicated by truly independent labs. He pointed to potential methodological flaws that might not be obvious in the final data. Subtle cueing, sensory leakage, problems with randomization or judging protocols, and crucially, the file drawer problem.
The idea that failures don't get published.
Exactly. We see the successes, but how many failed experiments were never written up, skewing the overall statistics? Hyman argued the apparent consistency Utz saw was potentially illusory, an artifact of these cumulative methodological issues rather than a genuine psychic effect. His conclusion: the results were intriguing, maybe even baffling, but calling it proof was premature.
So an inexplicable statistical anomaly, but no consensus on what it meant. Was it real cedar or just flawed experiments producing weird stats?
That's the nub of the scientific debate that continues, in some circles, even today. But here's the thing. For the CIA and Congress in 1995, this academic debate was ultimately irrelevant.
Why? Because it wasn't about pure science.
Exactly. Stargate wasn't a university physics experiment. It was an intelligence program. It had to be judged on its operational value. Did it produce actionable intelligence?
Intelligence you can actually use to make decisions, plan operations, protect assets.
Precisely. Can you trust the remote viewers report enough to send troops, launch a drone, make a diplomatic move?
And the verdict from AIR on that score.
Unequivocal and damning. The AI report concluded, and this is a direct quote floating around, that the program was never useful in any intelligence operation.
Never. In 23 years and $20 million.
That was their finding. The information was consistently too vague, too ambiguous, filled with irrelevant and erroneous data. There was no reliable way to know if a viewer's report was a stunning hit or complete garbage before you got ground truth confirmation. And for intelligence, that makes it operationally useless.
So even if the statistical anomaly was real, they couldn't harness it reliably.
Correct. The signal-to-noise ratio was abysmal. Based largely on this finding, the CIA issued its final memorandum in September 1995, effectively killing the program.
It laid out specific recommendations.
4 key ones that sealed Stargate's fate. 1. Terminate all operational remote viewing. It doesn't produce actionable intelligence. Terminate all research and development. The existence of the phenomenon itself remains unproven and unclear, so stop spending money trying to understand or enhance it.
3 is the big one for us today.
Absolutely. Recommendation 3. Conduct a comprehensive declassification review of all program files from both the CIA and Department of Defense periods and transfer them to the National Archives. Open the floodgates.
And 4 basically shut the door on the original premise.
Yes. Recommendation 4. Stop worrying about the psychic gap. Apply no further resources to assessing foreign psychic threats. The whole thing was officially declared a dead end.
And that declassification, that's the moment Stargate dies as a secret program and is reborn as a public legend. Section 6, Legacy and Speculation.
It's almost ironic. The program failed operationally, but the release of its weird, raw, often unfiltered files gave it a second life, a much more powerful life in popular culture and conspiracy circles.
Because suddenly anyone could read these seemingly incredible transcripts of psychic missions, often without the context of the failures or the critical evaluations.
Exactly. And the absolute superstar document, the one that fueled decades of fringe speculation, has to be the Mars transcript.
Dated May 22, 1984. What was the setup for this session?
The viewer, widely believed to be McMoneagle again, was handed a sealed envelope. Inside, a 3x5 card with just this written on it. The planet Mars. Time of interest approximately 1 million years BC.
Wow. Talk about a specific and bizarre target. What did the viewer report seeing?
It reads like something out of science fiction. Oblique views of a desolate Martian landscape, but with structures. He describes seeing something like a pyramid or pyramid form, huge, yellowish ochre, also megalithic structures, large flat surfaces, high walls, clearly suggesting artificiality.
And not just structures, but inhabitants.
Yeah, this is where it gets really strange. He describes seeing shadow people, very tall, very thin. Later, directed to when they were alive, he described them using the pyramid structures as shelters or stasis chambers.
Hiding from something.
Apparently, yes. He reported a sense of them fleeing a major geologic problem, some kind of environmental catastrophe, maybe a massive storm. These beings were described as ancient, dying out, the ones who sleep through the storms.
Okay. That transcript lands in the public domain and immediately gets connected to another fringe theory, right? The face on Mars.
Instantly. Back in 1976, the Viking 1 orbiter took that famous low-res photo of the Cydonia region, showing a mesa that looked uncannily like a human face.
NASA said it was just shadows, an optical illusion.
Correct. And later, high-resolution images from Mars Global Surveyor and others confirmed it's just a natural geological formation, an eroded hill. But in the 80s and 90s, theorists like Richard Hoagland built a whole mythology around it, claiming the face, nearby pyramids, and a city were proof of a lost Martian civilization.
And the Stargate Mars transcript was seen as the government's smoking gun confirmation.
Exactly. Conspiracy forums lit up. Here's a top-secret U.S. psychic spy describing pyramids and tall, thin, ancient beings on Mars. Around the same time, Hoagland was talking about artificial structures in Cydonia. It seemed like official validation. The Stargate program became inextricably linked to ufology and ancient alien theories, despite the scientific debunking of the face.
So the declassification fueled existing conspiracies. It also fueled speculation about the program itself, didn't it? The idea that it never really stopped.
Oh yeah, the program went dark theory. This is huge among believers. The argument is the 1995 termination was just for show, a public relations move.
Because the potential power was too great to just abandon.
That's the idea. They couldn't get reliable, actionable intelligence, okay. But the UTS report suggested something real was happening statistically. So the theory goes, the work was simply privatized. Moved off the government books, maybe to contractors or private labs run by the original researchers, to continue away from congressional oversight and the need for battlefield results.
Is there any evidence cited for this?
Proponents point to the post-1995 careers of the key players. Hal Puthoff founded EarthTech International. Look at what they study: quantum vacuum energy, zero-point energy, interstellar flight, consciousness studies. All very fringe, but conceptually linked to the kind of reality-bending ideas Stargate explored.
And Edwin May, the last director.
He founded the Laboratories for Fundamental Research, which openly continued psi research. May himself has said publicly he has no doubt psi exists. So the key people definitely kept working on related topics, just not under a government codename. Whether that means the program secretly continued is pure speculation, though.
And the speculation even extends to things like assassinations. Pat Price.
Right. Price died of a heart attack back in 1975. But because he was considered such a gifted viewer, a persistent conspiracy theory claims he was actually assassinated, maybe by the KGB, using some kind of psychic attack or untraceable poison because he was too dangerous to the Soviets. There's zero evidence for this, but it shows how the Stargate legend invites these kinds of paranoid interpretations.
Before we wrap up, we absolutely have to touch on the cultural impact. Stargate might have failed as an intelligence program, but it succeeded wildly as source material.
Hugely successful. The biggest impact probably came from John Ronson's 2004 book, The Men Who Stare at Goats, and the George Clooney movie adaptation in 2009.
That book focused on the sheer absurdity, right?
Yeah.
The weirdest corners of the program.
Exactly. Ronson dug up the stories about the 1st Earth Battalion, the New Age military concepts, and yes, the rumored attempts to psychically stop the hearts of goats just by staring at them. That imagery soldiers trying to kill goats with their minds became the dominant public perception of the program.
So Stargate entered popular culture not as a serious scientific debate, but as this bizarre, darkly funny example of government waste and Cold War craziness.
It cemented it in the public imagination that way. It's a much more memorable and frankly entertaining story than arguing about p-values and file drawers.
And you see echoes even now in current pop culture.
Stranger Things, the huge Netflix show. It's practically a fictionalized Stargate.
How so?
You have a secret government lab run by the Department of Energy, but clearly analogous to the CIA idea. Experimenting on a gifted psychic child, 11. They put her in sensory deprivation tanks, give her coordinates, and have her remote view Soviet targets, listen in on conversations, even try to use her offensively. It's Stargate's premise, just with added monsters and 80s nostalgia.
So, pulling it all together, what's the final takeaway on the original Project Stargate and all its controversy?
It leaves us with this really fascinating, kind of frustrating paradox. On the one hand, you have the official verdict, unambiguous operational failure, $20 million spent over 23 years, produced no reliable, actionable intelligence. The greatest hits dissolve under scrutiny. It was, by military and intelligence standards, a bust.
But, on the other hand,
Yeah.
you have that persistent, nagging statistical anomaly in the lab data. One credible statistician called proven and a prominent skeptic admitted was inexplicable, even if he attributed it to flaws. That scientific question mark hasn't entirely disappeared, and the declassification just poured gasoline on the fire.
Absolutely. Releasing those raw, bizarre, context-free files in 1995 guaranteed Stargate's immortality. It failed miserably as a secret government program, but it became vastly more influential and successful as a modern legend, a touchstone for everything from government secrecy to paranormal belief to alien conspiracies.
So it brings us back, in a weird way, to the name. The original Stargate sought a gateway, a strategic advantage, through the mysteries of the human mind. Cost $20 million.
And the new Stargate, the AI project, seeks the exact same kind of revolutionary strategic advantage, that same gateway, but through $500 billion worth of silicon and algorithms.
So here's the final thought we want to leave you with. Is the reuse of that specific code name, Stargate, just a lack of imagination in some naming committee?
Right.
Or does it reflect something deeper, a kind of eternal hope, maybe even a recurring governmental gamble, that the ultimate competitive edge, the key to solving everything, always lies just tantalizingly out of reach, just beyond the borders of our current understanding, something to chew on?